On today's What Do We Do podcast, Priya Mann joins us in studio. As one of the premier journalists in the entire country, Priya is here to share with us what it's like to be a journalist today, but more importantly, what it will take to be a great journalist in the future. She also shares her life story, as well as gives us all tips and tricks to build a great personal brand. It's gonna be a great show, so hit the subscribe button, give us a follow, and let's go. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the What Do We Do podcast. I'm your host, Dewey Steffen, and this is another guest episode. These are episodes where we bring on in a leader from the community who has a story to tell, knowledge to share, and advice to give. And then we invite them out into the studio because as a team, together, everyone achieves more. And today's guest is none other than the amazing and award-winning Priya Mann. Priya is an award-winning journalist as well as an anchor reporter for WDIV Channel 4, which is the local NBC affiliate here in Metro Detroit. Priya, it's great to see you.
It's great to be here, Dewey. I'm in your studio today.
I know, it's kind of roles in reverse, right? And we'll get into that with our audience because they're like, what? But we'll talk about that later. Okay. But first, I always start the show with the game we like to play called High-Low.
All right.
And what that is what has been the high point and low point of your career to this point?
I think overall, a high point for me has been when you can use your platform as a storyteller to do good. Whether it's covering a house fire and the family sets up a GoFundMe because they've lost everything and people are so moved by their story that they donate. And then the family is flooded with donations to help them in a really difficult time. I think it's been amazing to connect people with missing animals. There's been stories where you've been able to use the platform in a way that connects people for the greater good. I've done some stories on like a kid who's doing a lemonade stand for somebody on a street who has cancer. And people see a story like that and the next day there's a line for that kid who's busy giving everyone cups of lemonade. I think that's certainly been a high point when you can see how journalism, how your stories can have an impact and really do a little bit of good in the world.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
I wish they're all high points, but what would be a low point?
I think a low point for sure is, as you know, journalism is a competitive industry. You are up against other stations and other reporters on big stories. And over the course of my career, there's certainly been times where I've broken stories, but I've also missed out on stuff. And whenever you get a phone call from your news director, moments after your live shot is done, that's not usually, you did great, kiddo. That's usually, why did the other station have this? And then you're scrambling to try and figure out how you can get that missing nugget of information. I think that it helps you grow because it's an adrenaline rush, right? You're going to deadline and you don't know what the other stations have until airtime. But that has certainly been, you feel it for a few days at least afterward because you want to be the first and you want to be accurate. But sometimes you get beat. And I just know now, if I see that number pop up a second after my live hit, okay, what's the work I got to do to catch up? It hasn't happened often, but it certainly happened.
That's the key. It hasn't happened often, right? And no one's perfect. So,
nope,
but that's what you learn. That's what you grow, right?
Right?
Mistakes make you grow.
Yeah, and then you know which reporters to watch out for when you're covering a story. You're like, okay, I know that I don't want that reporter to scoop me again, you know?
That's great. So there's some competitive, I think in this town in particular, but probably even across the country, it's an industry of peers. And so I think you might know, who in your peer group, it's competitive, but it's friendly competition. Yes. Maybe?
I think for the most part, it is friendly competition, especially as a morning reporter and anchor when I am out in the field. I do think there's a kinship, probably because of the hours we work, which are pretty crazy. But there is a shared sense of we're in this together, especially when you're out in the elements, right? When you're out reporting and it's below freezing in the middle of a snowstorm, you might help each other out.
You guys bring each other hot cocoa and wait out for the person to come out of the house 8 hours later.
I've had people come up to us in the live truck with pizza or with water or popsicles on a really hot day people can really surprise you sometimes. It's been really nice.
Well, that's great. And on this show, we always talk about community. And although we might have different jobs or be competitors, we're still part of a community.
Yes.
And that should trump all, right? So teamwork, together, everyone achieves
Makes
more.
the dream work, right?
Makes the dream work. You got it. Well, that's a great segue. And sorry for those lows, but we'll again keep them to a minimum.
But you learn from the lows. The lows are just as important as the highs. I think it was the dad on Little House on the Prairie who was telling Laura Ingalls that you need to experience the valleys so you can appreciate the peaks. You learn far more from failure than you ever do success. I think that's a really important thing to remember.
That's fantastic. Absolutely. And for all those younger viewers and listeners out there, go ahead and Google Little House on the Prairie so you know what we're talking about.
It was, again, just to be fair, it was an old show when I was a kid watching it.
Right. For sure. Mentoring you.
It was a classic show back then, okay?
Absolutely. Good stuff. Well, that's a great segue, Priya, into, did you know, like, at some point in particular that you wanted to be a journalist? Like, how did this journey to where you are today begin?
I think there were a lot of little things along the way. There wasn't one particular aha moment, but I'm very fortunate that my parents really encouraged me to pursue journalism when I was in college. But there were little things along the way that really, if you were to put them all together, I'm doing exactly what I was meant to do. One thing was I liked public speaking. That wasn't a fear for me. I was on the school announcement team from second grade all the way through my senior year. I was sort of fearless when it came to just speaking my mind as long as I came prepared. That was something my parents really encouraged, was to debate them, which coming from an Indian background isn't always the case. But my parents were very, they were just the kind of people who were like, hey, we want you to explore who you are, but come informed, come with facts if you want to debate us on things. And trust me, I didn't win many of those debates, but I learned the art of communication. Also, I think that I also learned from a young age just how powerful the ability to communicate your ideas is, and that most of our communication is nonverbal, and learning that and understanding that. And there were little things too. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation. My parents immigrated from India. And from a young age, I recognized that my parents had slight accents. And I wanted to sound like my teachers in school. And so I would sit there on the floor. We had a floor-length mirror. And I would sit there and I would repeat words over and over again. And I'd see how my lips moved. I would see how my tongue hits the top of the roof of my mouth. And I would practice words over and over, kind of improving my diction. My parents subscribed to 2 newspapers growing up, and one was a little bit more on the intellectual side, the other was a little bit more blue collar. But what was great about that, especially back in the day when we didn't have smartphones and we didn't have technology, was I was getting multiple viewpoints on the same story. So I would read one newspaper, and I didn't know this at the time. I didn't have the verbiage for it at the time, but these were all sort of planting seeds, and I enjoyed ongoing stories. So there were several court cases in the mid-90s that really gripped my attention. And it reminded me a little bit at the time of soap operas, because every day you'd wait for the newspaper to come in, and then in the morning, and then you'd start poring over the articles and new information would have been revealed in court. And there was actually it was such a high profile case that it had some international attention. But the rules in Canada are different from the rules in America. So a publication ban doesn't necessarily prevent outlets from other countries from reporting the information. And so it was very interesting to see how some of those court cases played out in the minds of the public when you had some, outlets that couldn't report it, but then you would find outlets that could in America. And these were all things that were happening in like middle school for me. I mean, I remember some of my earliest, the articles that I read, I was in elementary school. And part of that was I learned about Western culture from pop culture, from TV shows and sitcoms, and also from newspapers. My home life was very Indian. And then my school life, I'm from Canada, from the Toronto area. My school life was very different. It was very westernized. And I had to understand, I clearly knew my home world, but I wanted to fit in. I think as kids, we really want to fit in. The beauty of getting older is you enjoy standing out. But I really wanted to fit in. So it was my gateway to understanding. So I would, through reading newspapers, also watching like the Oprah Winfrey Show, I really loved her interview style. And she also talked about issues that were very taboo at the time. She really pushed the envelope. And from a sociological perspective, it was really interesting to see her take on things and how she spoke about them. The guests that she brought on, the kinds of difficult conversations she would have on TV. And those were all sort of the building blocks. My love for reading, my love for stories. I read a lot of novels as a kid. And then, of course, pop culture and icons for me like Barbara Walters or Diane Sawyer or Oprah Winfrey, and watching them in their element, watching women in their element. That was something that you didn't really see as much of on local news growing up as you do now, especially women of color, seeing how their lived experience is told and depicted. And all of those things kind of worked its way into I was in college, I was getting an undergrad in communications. My parents wanted me to get a degree that kind of would be open-ended because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so communication seemed like a great avenue because you could do marketing or advertising or PR or journalism. And when it came time to start thinking about specializing, it was my parents who encouraged me to pursue journalism. And I will never forget this. It was my mother and I were making her bed in her bedroom, and she's on one side of the bed and I'm on the other side. And we're talking about what's next. And at this point, I was in the third year of my degree, and I hadn't noticed a huge difference between what I was learning in second and third year. And I was really starting to think, well, I'm in a 4-year program. What's next? And so we were having this conversation. And while we're making the bed, and it's interesting how those simple moments can really change the trajectory of your life, my mother mentioned, well, what about becoming a reporter? And I instinctively responded, well, that's not a good idea because there's so many other factors at play. It's not just about if you get the highest grade or you work the hardest. If you want to be a reporter, how you look plays a role. If a station already has a person of a certain demographic, will they want to? It can be, and it's a tough business. Sometimes it's not fair. And I said, I don't know. There's too many risks in this career. It's not stable. And my mom, who is a pragmatic immigrant, who is very successful in her own right, said to me as she was making the bed, she looked across the bed and she looked at me and she goes, but you were always going to wonder what if. And that stayed with me. And so she suggested, let's pursue journalism and volunteer at a cable station, see if you like it. And if you do it for free, that will tell you that you have what it takes, the desire and the commitment to actually get paid for it, because nobody's paid a lot right out of school, especially in my industry. And that's what I did. I got into my post-secondary program for a post-grad in journalism. And, there was the creme de la creme university in Canada, and that was the one I wanted to go to. And I was so confident that I was going to get into this school that was the only one that I applied to, because I had switched from a 4-year to a 3-year degree. It was the
University of Michigan of Canada. No,
yeah, exactly. But, go blue. And so I was only going to apply to the one university. And my mom said to me, just as a backup, just apply to this other college. And I was like, okay, whatever. And, this is back in the day when the size of the envelope would tell you the answer of whether you got in or not. And I got a medium-sized envelope from my dream school, and it said I'd made the wait list. And I got accepted into my second choice.
Okay.
And I ultimately went to my second choice, but I firmly believe the reason I got my first job is because I volunteered at that cable station while I was doing that 2-year degree. And that time, I created a reel that was not what my college peers were doing from school. This was a reel that was stories. Yes, it's volunteers. Yes, it's cable, but it was on TV. And the storytelling was different. The editing was different. It set me apart just a bit. I graduated in 2008, right when the Great Recession hit. And I think that's had a huge impact on me because you are entering the job market when everything is imploding. The housing market had just imploded and the stocks were crashing. And in Canada, entire morning shows at that time were being completely cut. And at that same time, my parents moved to the US. So my family left to move to Charlotte. And I have just graduated, and I've got a summer internship in Windsor, actually, which obviously borders Detroit. And I'm working there as an intern, and I don't have a place to go in September. And my parents have moved. And it was a very interesting time for me because a lot of my classmates, Facebook was still kind of in its infancy. It was still gaining popularity. It's nothing like it is today. And through just a few updates, the sense was, if we can't find something right away, we'll just move back home. Well, that wasn't an option for me. I could have lived in one of my, auntie or uncle's basements, but that was not ideal for an independent young person who wants to kind of take life and experience everything it has to offer. And so it really lit a fire in my belly. I had to succeed. There was no other option. I had to figure out a way to make this work. And I got my first job out west in a tiny town called Kamloops, British Columbia, which is a province that neighbors Washington State. It was a town of 90,000 up in the mountains. It was a lumber town. And, I'm coming from a suburb of Toronto. I mean, I grew up around millions of people, and now I'm in a town of 90,000. And that was a very transformative year for me. I learned a great deal. And I also encourage young people, especially if they can, to move for work, for life experience, because you start to understand that you need to adapt and learn the issues that are affecting the community that you're living in. I didn't know anything about this tiny town of Kamloops. I'd never heard of the pine beetle, the Asian pine beetle, before I'd gone out there. This pine beetle, though, was ravaging the lumber industry. Entire generations had worked at some of the mills in this town, and all of a sudden, this little insect is decimating all of the trees. This is something I learned when I moved out there. I would not have learned these things, and I would not have learned their perspective of folks from Toronto had I not made that move. So I think throughout my career, moving around, being around new people, moving to a different country, all of those things have helped me kind of learn nuance and dig a little deeper. If you want to be a storyteller, you have to understand context. You have to understand nuance and history in order to tell a story that actually resonates. That takes time, that takes curiosity, and that takes you being comfortable, being uncomfortable because you're somewhere new. I think those have been major themes in my life.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. And there's so much there that we're going to peel back. Okay, we're just going to keep going.
Okay.
So for our audience's benefit, were you born, a couple questions then you can answer. Were you born in Canada?
Yes.
And then you said raised outside of Toronto, a suburb of Toronto. Mm-hmm. Then ultimately, it sounds like your entire family moved to Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah.
But what university did you go to?
Okay.
And then with that job out west with the pine beetle, what were you doing there for that station? And as, again, you talk about starting in the Toronto area and then moving country, then going out west and then moving countries, kind of walk through, again, your steps up the ladder along the way.
Okay, I hope I remember all of these questions. I might need your guidance along the way.
Born in Toronto,
in Etobicoke, Ontario. In fact, the college where I did my postgrad in journalism was right across from the hospital where I was born. And it felt very full circle because as soon as I graduated, I started moving and, my career kind of took me all over the country in Canada. So born in Toronto, my career trajectory first took me...
University.
So I did my undergrad in communications at Brock University, which is in the Niagara Falls area. And then that was a 3-year degree. And then I did a 2-year postgrad in journalism at Humber College in Toronto. It was during that time in Humber College, those 2 years, that were the most difficult of my life. I've never worked harder because I was juggling going to school full time, interning at the #1 station in Toronto. I was waitressing. I've either waitressed or sold shoes before I became a journalist. So I was doing that. And then I was volunteering at the cable station. And so I literally remember that I had a different mindset from Friday through Sunday because now I was waitressing, I was hustling, getting some stuff done at home, finishing up some assignments. And then Monday through Thursday, I was either at school or I was taking the train into Toronto to intern at that TV station. And then I was also shooting stories at the cable TV station. And it actually got to the point, I think some of my professors recognized there was some talent there. And I told them, hey, I'm really getting some opportunities at this cable station. I'm rising up the ranks. The kind of stories I'm telling are different. It was a very busy election year one year. And I remember I got to do some of that election coverage because I'm from Mississauga, Ontario, which is a town of 700,000. So there's a many, many issues and needs going on there that should be addressed and covered. And they were like, okay. So they would give me time off from classes. I would still get my assignments done, but they would give me time off because they knew that I was at Rogers TV volunteering. And that really built the foundation for me. Those were the hardest 2 years of my life. And I also think that everybody at some point should work in the service industry so that you understand how to be a kinder, more compassionate person. Because when you're on the other side of things, waitressing really helped me. And then waitressing was incredible because not only is it the most difficult job that I've ever done, but you also have to juggle multiple things at once. You've got multiple tables. I would have nightmares. I would literally wake up and be like, I forgot their drink order. Like, I haven't had that so much in my journalism career, but those about 4 years when I was waitressing, you have to learn a lot. You have to read people. You have to know when things aren't really going well, maybe emotionally at that table, so you want to give them some space, or you know that somebody in the kitchen messed up, and now you've got to deal with the brunt of whatever the customer is saying with a smile on your face when you know the other table is still waiting for their meal or their dessert or their bill. So I learned a lot doing those part-time jobs, but those 2 years were the most formative. It really helped me learn how to balance my time. It helped me obviously learn how to connect with people, but I was also fostering my own passion, which was storytelling. And so it was a very creative, tiring, but very creative time for me.
That's a great segue. You didn't even know it, but we met, at your local station here, WDIV-Local 4. Every once in a while, a producer of a segment may invite me to come on in and talk about, some financial matters.
Talk about money.
Talk about the cash.
Yeah.
Right? Cash is
How do
key.
we save it?
And so one time, and I don't know if it was the first time, it might have been, it was students going back to college. And so we talked about like what the students should prepare for or what the parents should prepare for. And we talked about not getting into debt and maybe having a side hustle or working a little bit if your studies allow. And I remember, distinctly you saying, and check it out, it's on our YouTube channel, the interview, you said, I've been working since I was 14, right? And I said, me too. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
And waiting tables, bossing tables, even being a dishwasher, understanding what it's like to be communicating with others, but where they're in control and you have to deal with the temperaments and then the bosses of the place, and so all of it's a lot of customer interaction, whether it's you to the TV, you to your audience, or you to person, right?
You know what my very first job was, now that I remember this conversation? It was delivering newspapers.
Okay.
We had a small community paper, and it would come in big bundles, and you'd have to assemble it, like put the flyers in a certain section and put all the sections together, and I had a little wagon. And we would put the newspapers in there, and I would just walk around the neighborhood delivering them. So kind of full circle in a way. But that was my first gig.
If you have a photo of that, we'll be happy to put it as part of the B-roll for this episode.
People were definitely not taking pictures back then the way they are now, because I would have probably taken a selfie like, look at this stack.
Right. And that'd have been marketing, actually. You probably would have sold more for sure. But so let's talk about how you got here to Detroit. And before we talk about that, I'm going to say you don't, from my perspective, have an Indian accent. We talked about that earlier, you did, but also you don't have a Canadian accent, eh? So I'd like to, understand, like you must have pivoted again and gone from the Canadian accent to the American accent with the tongue roll and whatever else as you got to the United States. Because
you know what's so funny about that is most of my cousins live in the States, and growing up, they would make fun of our Canadian accent. And I'd be like, I can't hear it. What are you talking about? And then I started living in the States, and a couple of years after I started living in the States, I put on Canadian news, and I was like, oh my gosh, I hear it. It's so distinct now, but I could not hear it when I was growing up. No Indian accent, because I was obviously born and raised in Canada, and English is my first language. But when it came to kind of losing a little bit of the Canadian twang, that was very deliberate, and that's something that, again, comes with curiosity and observation. You start to pick up a little bit on the dialect and the way people speak when you're in new surroundings. And that's what I did. I was working in a medium-sized market in Canada when I got the desire to move to the States. And it was a very lofty goal. It's very rare that a Canadian can make the jump to the States. When I wasn't a national reporter in Canada, I wasn't working in Toronto, which was a major market.
BBC.
Right. Well, that was British, so it would be a CBC
the
for
CBC,
Canada.
we'll edit that out.
No, you better keep that, because that's a common thing.
Okay.
Actually,
the CBC.
Do you know what's so heartwarming?
Hockey Night in Canada. I mean, they have a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. When I first started working at Local 4, Devin Skillian had a big, our main anchor had a big CBC poster on his door, and I was like, I'm home. It felt so great. Like, what are the chances, right? But yeah, so I was working in a medium-sized market, and I had this idea that I wanted to come to the States because from an industry point of view, nothing really beats the news in America. Like, nothing kind of comes close. There's so much happening in this country, but it's a very lofty goal. And I remember when I first kind of had this idea, there were people in my parents' group, like social group, who must have been well-intentioned, but their point was, oh, she won't be able to come to the States unless she gets married to an American. And I remember hearing that and being like, oh, well, I'm just going to prove you wrong. But it is very difficult. And I started applying to American TV stations. And I will never forget this. I was sitting in my little kitchen on my computer, and I'm typing in US TV agents because I was like, I've heard that you need agents in the US in order to kind of shop around. And I was literally sending YouTube links of some of my work, started talking to some agents, and I was being very selective with the direction that I wanted to go, because in this case, they are representing you. I'm not even in the country. Like, I need somebody who I feel confident can express the kind of person I am and what my goals are for my career from an authentic and genuine space. And there were some agents, and all they talked about was your look. What are you wearing? Why are you moving your hands that way? I had another agent who was a woman who talked about my writing. And why did you pick that soundbite? And let's talk about, because I was an MMJ, which is a multimedia journalist for the first 5 years of my career. So I'm doing all the shooting, all the editing. I'm driving myself out to stories. You're really a one-man band. And she was asking more about my content. And I was like, you know what? I like her vibe. I think she represents me. And I interviewed in Seattle and Detroit. And I was actually holding out for the Seattle job because that was a weekday morning show as an anchor. And
they probably had a pine bug situation.
Well, I did know a little bit. It did help, actually. Like, look at that full circle, right? It actually helped me during that interview because I had worked in British Columbia. So I was familiar with the region. That job ended up going to an internal candidate, so it certainly helps soften the blow when it's an internal candidate. And in Detroit, I was holding out for the Seattle job, and when I finally my agent pushed and we were like, okay, Seattle's not happening, and we went to Detroit, my news director, I didn't know she'd become my news director at the time, but she said that if we had waited one more day, she was going to go with someone else. And that's just fate, right? And I had to work extremely hard. I thought getting the job meant it was a done deal, but immigration is a very challenging process. And I think—
So you got married?
No, I definitely did not. And it was a real badge of honor for me when I did get to the States on my own. Very blessed that WDIV sponsored me for a visa, which is an incredibly rare thing. And I remember I got the job in September, but I didn't get the visa until December. So those 3 months were the hardest of my life. The newsroom that I was in at that time was very problematic for different reasons, and I really wanted to get out. Also, being an MMJ for more than 5 years, I was burnt out. It is a very difficult thing to do day in, day out. But I got to tell you, my biceps had never been stronger when I was carrying a camera and a tripod. And so those 3 months were difficult. It was like I had this deep down, just, am I going to get it? Am I not? Am I stuck here? Do I get to go? And I remember I'm sitting at my desk. That newsroom was located in the basement of the building. And I get a call from my agent, and she's like, can you go somewhere private? And I'm like, okay, for sure. I didn't get the visa, and she wants me to go somewhere so I can cry. And I went upstairs, and we had a little picnic bench where some of the older folks smoked. Nobody was there at the time. And I sat down on the picnic bench. I'm like, okay. And she's like, you're coming to Detroit. And it took me, the words didn't even compute. I was like, wait, what? Because I was on the verge of tears. I did start crying, but for a very different reason. And I'll never forget getting off the phone with her, walking back down those stairs and being like, I'm out of here in 2 weeks. And I remember when I told my news director I'm leaving to go to Detroit, she didn't believe it. Like, how are you getting to the States? And I think that, you mentioned, did you get married? You got to believe in yourself. And I think that the thing that irked me the most is that it was well-intentioned. They're trying to spare you the pain you're going to feel when you're not successful. But nobody really knows what you're made of except you. And I believed in myself and I believed in my ability, and it was hard. Like the process of coming to this country has been extremely difficult. The process of staying in this country. And then as a journalist, when I came to Detroit, it's a whole new culture. I mean, even though I grew up only 4 hours away, it is completely different from a socioeconomic standpoint, the cultural issues, judicial systems, the way areas are divvied up, whether it's counties or sheriffs, the equivalent of like state police versus, RCMP, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our like sort of national police law enforcement body.
They've got pretty dope uniforms, by the way. Those Mounties.
They do.
The Mounties.
Isn't that red jacket
Love that.
very sharp?
Yeah.
But you have to learn all these things. And so to come back to your original question about dialect, in addition to understanding like, how do I not sound as Canadian? Because I'm very proud of where I come from and who I am, but you also want to fit in. And you have to understand history, context. How is Detroit the city that it is? What brought it to the place that it was at when I started in 2013? What are the issues in different suburbs? Why do people feel the way they do? One example I can give you is that when I first moved to the States, I would say within the first year or two, the Supreme Court was ruling on same-sex marriage. And in Canada, it had been legalized by our version of the Supreme Court when I was in high school. So it was something that was not a point of conversation. But at this point in America, this was very much a hot button issue. And I had to really understand different sides and why people think the way they do and why they're so passionate about it, and represent different viewpoints while this was very much an ongoing issue with the Supreme Court's decision in the days leading up to their final decision. There were huge protests, and I had to understand why people think the way they do so I can tell their story. And that is a trust. I don't ever take it lightly, the trust somebody gives you when they tell you their story. There is an understanding that you are going to try your best to represent them as authentically as they are. But then you need to understand more about them. I always have a notepad and I always ask a million more questions than I'll ever have time for a 90-second story on TV. Because how do you know the parts to leave out if you don't have the bigger picture? Because we're constrained to time. We only get 90 seconds to tell a story. So it's got to be the most important things. But it's still got to reflect the accuracy and the context of the story. So you got to ask a lot of things. You got to be innately curious. Those things have helped me understand different cultures. I think moving around Canada, my first job was out west. Then I had 3 different markets in Ontario: Windsor, London, and Kitchener, Ontario. So I was moving around. I've been in the business for 15 years and I've moved 10 times.
I'll encourage our audience to go. We've had several other journalists on before, and you've all said the same thing, which is awesome. And we've had on one of your colleagues, Hank Winchester.
Love him.
He's amazing, and he was on. We've also had on Mike Valenti, if you're familiar with Mike and his story here in Metro Detroit, check him out. We've also had on Michael Patrick Shields, who has a national syndicated radio show in the mornings. We've also had on Ben Lyons, who's had a national presence from LA to New York and walked the red carpet with the microphone back in the day for E, etc. You've all said the same thing, that you kind of have to start, whether it's the mailroom or just carrying equipment, or as you called it, the MMJ.
Yeah, the multimedia journalist.
Right. So everyone said you have to start behind the camera and you have to do all of the grunt work.
Well, it wasn't behind the camera.
Okay. Well, So, and then my point with that, I guess, so thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
But you're not going to start with the role of on stage in the premiere role.
No.
In that.
But you don't want to.
Right.
You don't want to, because you're going to you have to figure out your own style. And I'm not talking about how you dress. I'm talking about how you tell stories. What is your interview style? How do you get people at ease? How do you deal with breaking news and deadlines and adrenaline rushes? How do you deal with technology going kaput seconds before your live shot? These things you want to learn in smaller markets and then work your way up. And then you want to be polished, right? But that takes time. My own personal writing style, how I track, how I do interviews, all of that has grown with time. The one thing I will say is that being an MMJ, doing all the shooting, the writing, tracking, being on camera, it teaches you a lot about what it takes behind the lens. And it helps you as a broadcast journalist use the elements that you have, whether it's the sound or the pictures, the video, what's most gripping. How do you use the elements of your field, and so in my case, broadcast, to its greatest advantage? How do you really make a story that resonates with viewers? You know, if you're a print journalist, it's all in your words, right? If you're a broadcast journalist, of course your writing is important, but it's also how are you using what the camera person has captured to really tell a story? I would not have appreciated that aspect of the job had I not had to pick up a camera and shoot stories myself. So that's a very collaborative process. I think the most successful people in the field are the ones who want to work with the people who are out there with them. So one of the first questions I'll always ask my photog, all right, what was your best stuff? What do you want to write to? I mean, we just did a story about a gym, play center that is opened up specifically for children on the spectrum. So the gym is designed differently, and some of the activities are very different. So the first thing when I got onto the truck and my camera guy and I are, talking about the story and kind of fleshing it out, I said, well, what's your best stuff? What am I going to write to? Like, which activities did you get that you have a great shot of that I'll write to? That's very much a collaborative process. I don't know how much I would have given that credence had I not had to do it myself in the early years. But having said that, after 5 years, I was burnt out and ready to leave the industry. When I came to Detroit, actually, was the first market where I didn't have to shoot my own stuff. And that was I was like, wow, I can just do an interview without glancing over, looking at my audio levels, or have I white balance, or is a person in frame? I mean, even shooting your own stand-ups when you're a one-man band is an art. Like, you would be like, okay, where do I want to stand for my stand-up? So say it's at that chair. I would place something at that chair, take the camera, I would zoom in, focus, zoom back out, and keep it as wide as possible, hit record, then I'd walk up there, stand there, pick up the mic that was on the ground, say my spiel, put the mic down, walk back to the camera, stop recording, then watch it. Did it work? How was the lighting? Did my hair suddenly mess up? Did the audio crackle? Suddenly when you have somebody doing those things and you can just focus on the art of storytelling, it was amazing. It was the peak. That was a peak. I needed some of those valleys to understand what it was like at the peak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can understand that. And hopefully everyone out there listening and watching. And again, we want to thank you for tuning into this episode. Please give it a follow, give it a like, give it a subscribe. As we always say, together, everyone achieves more. But with that, in today's day and age, everyone is an MMJ because they're doing their own interviews. They're doing their own, I guess maybe podcasts, but everyone's doing selfies and moving around and doing what they're doing. And I think if we take what you just said and we put some B-roll on it, it could be even people who are suit and tied on the top and they got a little party going on in their, pajamas in the bottom.
We were all doing it.
No, for sure. But that's the same idea, right? To where you had to make sure that you had everything in frame. And actually, and there's no secret for people who have seen our social media, when I'm interviewed, whether it's remote, from my office, we just have things on cardboard boxes, but the screen behind, everything looks,
it's not glamorous.
Right.
I think that's one of the misconceptions is that this is a glamorous gig. It is not. It's a lot of long hours, weird hours, but it's worth it. It's worth
the 90 seconds of airtime with those celebrities is the glamour, but it's the 8.5 hours beforehand.
Oh my God.
Right?
And I always love when people are like, you have to shoot all this for a 90-second story. You're like, yeah, it takes a lot to put together something that's, informative and entertaining.
That's right. We call it content, right?
Exactly.
So that's another segue. So we're going to talk about.
If I can for a second, because I think you were talking about how everybody's got a phone and everybody's recording. There are some great benefits to that. I think that there are stories that would not be covered if there wasn't video to go along with it. I think there's some cases where you wouldn't have convictions if there wasn't video evidence from somebody who picked up their phone and started recording. The one challenge is that we're at a very unique cross point in time where traditional news outlets are under increasing scrutiny, and rightfully so, about accuracy and about balance and about bias. The challenge becomes in the time that we're at with social media and the internet is that anybody can put anything they want out there. Traditional outlets are held to a higher standard of accountability. We can't just put something blatantly false out there. We'll get sued at the end of the day. That's not truly the case for people who are on the streets, recording something crazy happening, who are just talking to their phone, showing people what's happening. That's very different. And there's been a lot of cases where That's how misinformation is spread. It's just the world we live in now, and you can't unring the bell. It's out there, and that's how we consume news. And I think that we're at an interesting point in my industry about how we're using different platforms to reach new viewers. And I think that the number one thing that you hear is the days of a stuffy reporter who's, I'm going to be serious and you're going to pay attention to me. That is not relatable anymore. You want to just talk to people like you're seeing somebody talking to you on your screen. Plus the screen is changing, right? It's not the big screen that you're watching at a certain time of day. People are on their phones, generally scrolling through as news is happening. And so this is a very interesting time. I only started my career in 2008. And how technology has changed just from 2008 to 2024, how my job has changed, my day-to-day workflow is completely different. And we weren't trained for any of these things because it didn't exist when I was in college in the mid-aughts. So we're at a very interesting point in time. I just hope that we continue to have some safeguards or increase the amount of safeguards to circumvent some of the things that we see play out, especially on social media and shared on social media. I think that there are times where a lot of misinformation can be spread, but I also think it's very important for traditional news outlets to listen to the criticism and to look at best practices. That's the only way you improve. I'm only where I am today because I was willing to listen to constructive criticism. And I think that more and more journalists, of course you have to be passionate to do this job, but I do think we're at a very interesting time where we see how people communicate is changing, right? As a kid who understood from an early age, I kind of want to sound more like my teachers, and I'm going to over-enunciate and over-correct. We're also having to understand that the way people connect today is very different, and it's through this. So your style of communicating, when I'm talking to the camera, like, okay, look behind me, this is what's going on, let me show you. That's going to be very, yeah, there we go.
What's up? Hey,
this
what's
person,
up?
did you see it? Did you see what happened? Right?
Yeah.
That changes. It's a very different flow. It's a very different style of journalism. That's going to be very different than when I'm reporting on the news at the anchor desk where you've seen me for those segments that we've done together. So it helps build, you need to be able to adapt. And I think that that's the only way forward. Technology is changing how we communicate and how we connect. And so if you want to stay relevant, you have to figure out a way to cut above the noise. And I really think the way to do that is authenticity.
Yeah, absolutely. We totally believe in that, and being authentic and true and communicative, but transparent. All those things that maybe are easier said than done, but you need to do them. And I always say, have a strong sense of self. You need to learn who you are.
Yes.
And you said it, constructive criticism, we actually at our office, we call them just constructive comments. We think that the word criticism has a negative connotation.
Sure.
And if I'm criticizing you, it means that I'm being negative towards you, even though, so we got to put constructive in front of it. Okay. Why don't we just call them constructive comments?
I like that.
Right? And so the problem is, and people in my office, myself included, my family, my friends, everyone I come in contact with, everyone has a hard time accepting when people give them constructive comments. Everyone is quick to blame. Everyone's like, yeah, but. And it's like, and there's a place for that. But it's also like, again, whether it's in sports or in the business world, you want to do better. And the boss will tell you that sucked. Your producer's going to tell you they don't have any time. Well, it's a 90 seconds. So we'll just do better next time. No, it's got to always be chop, chop, right? That's how you get to the best level. Yeah. So with that, let's go into, the same idea of in 2024, from your perspective as a journalist and all those things you said about social media and evolution, what would be your recommendation for those college students out there or those in their 20s trying to build, their personal brand?
Well, I think you said something earlier that you have to get to know yourself. You have to figure out who you are. And I think there's so much pressure on young people to present this version of themselves online that will be liked and followed and that people will admire. And that doesn't always really lead to your target audience. I think some of the most effective influencers are the ones who stay authentic so that the people that they're bringing in relate to that content, and also being open to change. I think that we put a lot of pressure on outward-facing technology and how we are perceived by others. That is a big part of the modern experience. I would encourage younger people to take a moment to go inward, to figure out who you are. What is your voice? And maybe pause on posting. Because what we're realizing, especially with cancel culture, is that some things don't age well. And you don't necessarily want every idea that you have throughout the day to be out there forever, right? You have to understand, I think something Michael Jackson was really good at was he understood the power of secrecy. He understood that with his fame, taking prolonged absences actually helped increase the curiosity. Now that's Michael Jackson. That's a very different stratosphere. But I think
for those who don't know, Michael Jackson's the king of pop. Check that
everybody knows Michael Jackson. If you don't know Michael Jackson, then I might not be the ideal guest.
It's fantastic.
But on that note, I think that taking a moment to kind of figure out who you are before presenting, this puts a lot of pressure on young people. And I get it. They're doing it. It's already out there. I would just say, try to think a little bit about like just longevity. And just try to think, and it's hard. We're much more impulsive when we're younger. We're much more motivated by our emotions when we're younger. And those are beautiful things. That's why we take more risks when we're younger, right? But it is unfortunate when something that you may think is funny or some hot take on something, it may not be that hot, in 10 years. And I find it very unfortunate when young people run into issues like that. I, for one, and I'll only speak for myself, I'm very thankful I was able to grow up in a time without the technology, because I don't know if I'd have the job that I have if I was recording every single thing that I was doing when I was in high school and college.
Well, that's a joke that anyone who's middle-aged or upper young, you're upper young, okay? And I'll tell you this for a fact, because I've said this before on the podcast, my longevity is 0 to 39 is young, 40 to 79 is middle age.
Well, I'm on the cusp.
I get it, but you're still young. You're still young.
Yeah.
You're still young.
Yeah.
And then 80 to 120 is old. So
wow,
so that's what we do. Yeah, absolutely. So with that is two things. One that you said, there's the 24-hour rule that a lot of, I guess, especially young people knowing with their parents when they play sports, whenever anybody is upset about something.
Yeah.
Impose the 24-hour rule. Take a breath, and before you write those emails, before you yell at your professor, before you do whatever, just 24 hours. It's not going anywhere, but then you can actually get your thoughts together.
And maybe write it out in the moment in your notes.
That's great.
Where there's no danger of accidentally hitting send.
Yep.
Get it all out, then just wait a second. Just wait a second, take that deep breath, and then revisit. And in the next day, in 24 hours, if you still want to send that, well, maybe then calmer heads have prevailed and you're making the best decision for yourself. But I think more often than not, we may walk it back a little bit.
And you'll see people, celebrities primarily, if they do a tweet or an X or whatever it's called, they'll put it up and then they'll take it down. But it's still someone grabbed it. So it's out there, right? Because they do that in real life.
That's the thing. It's permanent.
Yeah.
You may think that it's gone, but it's not. Even when you delete something off your phone, you're really only deleting it from yourself.
Right.
If the authorities ever want to go in and look for it, they're going to find it. So it is out there. And it is the one thing I will say, though, when you talk to young people, it is very inspiring because the way they have connected to one another, social media has absolutely done a lot of harm, but there are some great avenues through social media, one being just access to information and content. You're able to find something so specific and so niche now. You couldn't do that before. Even just access to information, like we had to go to a library. Now we have
the Dewey Decimal System.
Oh gosh, yes. Oh, that brings me back.
The Dewey Decimal System, for all you folks out there, Google it, look it up. Many, many moons ago.
Now we're dating ourselves.
You're still young, okay, by my definition.
I'm on the cusp, but I will be middle-aged by your definition soon. And I mean, it's great, You
can change it. You can have your own. You can have, to 50 or 60 is young. Like, again, I actually probably should do that myself. So maybe I'll change it.
When I first started my career is when you're 23, and I wrote an elderly person, something had happened to them. And my colleague was like, well, how old are they? I was like, I don't know, like 60. And they're like, you think 60 is elderly?
Right.
And they're like, no. And I was like, oh, okay. And now at the age that I'm at, I'm like, oh my God, 60 is young. 60, you're still like moving, you take care of yourself, things are good. So it is interesting as you get older, you're like, oh wow, no. I feel like we're just kids at heart. I feel like when you talk to an 85-year-old, they'll feel 60. You know, I think it's very much a mindset. It's very much where you're at, kind of up here. This controls a lot of the output, right? And I know that seems kind of obvious, but your own mindset, your own ability to self-soothe, your own ability to sit with loneliness, your own ability to be joyful without going to excess, your ability to be grateful, all of these things, they help you. They're all tools that we need, and you only get that through time.
Well, I will say there's probably a little bit of genetics that happens, so there's a little bit, but we always say health is wealth. And from the financial planning perspective, you know, generations ago, the longevity or the mortality rate was, you know, in the 70s for both men and women. Well, now it's in the upper 80s for men and women. And a lot of it is, you know, were you married? Did you have a healthy, you know, lifestyle and that sort of thing? But as much as people maybe poo-poo Western medicine, all medicine has the ability to help and to create a longer and healthier and happier life. But there's things you have to do, and whether it's workout and all those things we'll get into in a minute. But health is wealth.
I agree.
And again, 60 is the new 30, okay?
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
We got it. With that, the next segment I want to get to is my favorite part of the show.
Okay.
Everyone loves What Do We Do? Everyone loves it. We know that. We got it. But sometimes they've had enough. Okay. Sometimes like, can we just get a timeout? Can we pivot? We want to know today what Priya do. Okay. And what Priya do, what that means is what would Priya Mann go back and tell her 18-year-old self or those 18-year-olds out there today so they can live their best life?
What I would tell my 18-year-old self, because that was a very challenging time for me. And I got sober 2 years ago. I quit drinking alcohol. And it has been the most challenging and most rewarding thing that I've ever done. I would not tell myself to not party and to not experiment and not to have life experiences because you need that in order to grow. I am who I am today. I have the level of empathy and compassion and a little bit of gangster because I've been through some things and I've experienced some things, whether it's internal or it's through my own lived experience out in the world. But you don't have those without making mistakes. You don't have those without scraping your knee and falling down a few times. It's about how many times you get back up. But I think what I would tell my 18-year-old self is to have ways to sit with like loneliness and to have ways to sit through sad times and understand that emotions ebb and flow and that if you're feeling sad, you're not gonna feel that way forever. I think when I was 18, everything seemed catastrophic and the end of the world. I think with time and actually going through some crises in life, you're like, okay, I got this. You know, you're able to scale it back, you know, and I wish that I had known a little bit more how to handle some of the tougher emotions because that is something I've had to learn in sobriety. And it has, I think my coping mechanism was to escape. But the problem is you don't want a life that you need to escape from. You want a life that you enjoy the ups and downs and know how to navigate big emotions. And that's my advice for somebody who's a young person kind of navigating the world, that there are going to be some challenging times. But again, you've got this. Just learning how to sit with some of those bigger emotions could have helped maybe calm down a little bit. It's taken years of like yoga, weightlifting, now running, to really create a mind-body connection for myself. And that's been really important for mindset. It's been really important for how I carry myself in the world. And it's also an outlet for me to kind of push through some of those difficult feelings. And I'm just a completely different person. I'm 2 years sober and, a lifetime to go, one day at a time. But that's, I think, my advice that I would give to young people is it's going to be all right. Let's learn some healthier coping mechanisms so that when those big emotions come, they don't seem as catastrophic.
Yeah, that's so important. I concur with what you said, and I appreciate you sharing that with our audience. Hopefully everyone out there is listening. And on that same note, again, know that you're not alone, right?
Exactly.
So you can go talk back to communication.
Yes.
Communication is currency. Get a therapist, have a friend, have a family member, find someone in your community, and you don't have to turn to drugs, alcohol, gambling, all these things that considering are unhealthy. Yeah.
That's what I like about the younger generation as well, because I do feel like even talking about mental health is something they've really spearheaded. Even when I was growing up in the late 90s and early aughts, I mean, mental health was not a word that we talked about. Understanding the importance of taking care of your mind was not a priority. At least it wasn't a normalized conversation the way it is now. And I really do commend young people for pushing that forward.
Yeah, mind, body, spirit, all those things together, right? Well, on that note, we're running out of time, Priya. We're not done, but we're time. Yep. So with that,
wait, did I get the shirt? Do I get it?
Yes,
Was it a good enough
we'll do
answer?
this at the end, but yes, booyah, tuya, for sure you get a shirt. It might say what Dewey do instead of what Priya do, but we'll see if we can get it specially made.
Yeah,
we'll work
let's
on
do that. Let's do that.
As we wrap up the show, can you share anything else out there with either what's happening in your life? Maybe let our audience know how they can learn more about you, see more about you, understand, and just anything else you want to share with our audience before we wrap up?
Well, I am training for a half marathon. This is something I wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone and really try before I start a new decade. And so that's happening in October. I'm actually going to run 4 miles after we're done here today as part of my training. So that's been really, again, sort of pushing myself and seeing what I'm really made of. I've never considered myself an athlete or a runner. These are all new identities for me. And I'm just learning to embrace the discomfort of it. I joined a run club a few months ago, and that was like the scariest thing I'd ever done. Because I was like, oh my God, what if I'm the slowest person? What if I'm totally out of shape? Or whatever your insecurities are. And I'm really glad that I pushed myself, because that's where I'm going tonight. And I wouldn't have that outlet if I hadn't been able to sit with the discomfort of trying it for the first time. So that's very exciting. Instagram, Priya K. Mann. Same with Facebook. I'm on Local 4, Channel 4. I'm the weekend morning anchor, and I'm a morning reporter during the week. And yeah, it's a great time. I've had a blast talking with you, and I hope that for young people, representation matters. When you see somebody who looks like you, or you see them with an attribute that you might want to have, as you mentioned, you're not alone. I think it's important to see other people who went up against the odds and how they're navigating life, because it is not all rainbows and unicorns. Life is hard. Life is challenging. It's messy, and it's real. And there's nothing better than that.
Life is real, and there's nothing better than that. I love that. We're going to steal that from you, and I think use that going forward.
Love it.
Well, Priya Mann, thank you again for joining us today. It's been amazing. Absolutely. And as I wrap up the show, I'll ask you to give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us a follow. Want to thank again the wonderful and amazing Priya Mann for being here today. And as I always say when I wrap up the show, live your best life, be radically generous, a great big booyah to ya. And this has been another episode of the What Do We Do podcast with the unforgettable Priya Mann, but we're just getting started. Booyah.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general information purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or any specific security. It's only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. As always, please remember investing involves risks and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.